in 1918, at the close of the First World War. I was the youngest of 3 children. My mother was a beautiful woman. She doted on her children frequently, none more so than on me, her mum's boy. My father was a travelling salesman. His word was law, and he expected to be served at a moment's notice. He was the wage earner, and he was quite good at it, and I suppose he thought that was enough. Even so, I loved my father very much, maybe in a different way from the way I cherished my mother, but it was love nonetheless. I had 2 sisters. Gerda, the oldest, was 6 years my senior, and Ellen, 4 years older than me. Growing up, we didn't fight or anything, but we were not what I would call really close either. The 3 of us did our own things, and except for my meal times, our worlds rarely intersected. We loved each other, of course, but the age differences just didn't allow for much common ground. In time, however, our family ties would prove themselves. Neither of my sisters were excellent students, which is no real surprise, considering the roles women played at the time. I was the studious one of the bunch, and I excelled at French and Latin, and quite honestly, I can even say I enjoyed school. I was enrolled at a fairly prestigious and well-known school, reserved for students expected to go to university. In school, I had a fairly good group of friends, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. Then in about 1933, just before I turned 16, everything changed. Suddenly, both my teachers and many of my long-time friends simply refused to speak with me and my Jewish friends. Eventually, the situation became so bad I was forced to leave school. I'm 93 years old, and I often can't remember what my daughter has told me to do just yesterday, but I will never forget what it felt to be ostracized like that. Unless you were there, you just cannot comprehend the phenomenon that was Hitler. Twice, in a distance which would be from here to the other, or less than that, 10 meters away, twice I've seen him. The people were hypnotized. Can you imagine that? I was in a city, and he had come through there with his guard there, and when he comes through, everybody said, "Hi," and their faces changed, and they like if they got an injection. "Hi, hi, hi." Unbelievable. It is unbelievable that the people could be like this. They were hypnotized. My parents left Germany 6 weeks before me in 1939, thinking that they would arrange my paperwork once they arrived in Brazil, where my sister Ellen had emigrated a few years earlier. I had intended to stay with my aunts and grandmother, but because the Gestapo was periodically stopped by the house asking about me, I ended up spending those 6 weeks bouncing from friends' places and in the Berlin Underground. During this time, I was waiting for my travelling papers to arrive from Australia, where my other sister Gerda had emigrated a year or 2 earlier with her husband. I had a couple of cousins who got picked up by the Gestapo and taken to what was called the Brown House, where they were beaten badly. I was 20 years old. It was an incredibly scary time. I remember myself by the moment I put my foot in there. I thank the Almighty that I made it to there. That was it. Now I'm free. It's very hard to describe that moment, but I knew it. I was free. I met my second wife, Gertie, through some friends who knew of my situation with my boy. She was from Austria and quite beautiful. I desperately needed somebody to help raise Rodney, and we got along very well. I didn't know anything about raising a small boy. She did, and was extremely good in looking after him. She looked after him for 10 years. She loved that boy like he was her own, and he loved her back just the same. In the meantime, after a stint working for my brother-in-law, cutting patterns for jackets and dresses, I would manage to start a small clothing manufacturing business with an acquaintance met through friends soon after World War II. Due to the effects of wartime rationing, many items, especially most types of fabrics, were hard to come by, so anything we could produce was bought up almost as quickly as we could manufacture it. Things were looking up. The three of us had a good life together, and then suddenly, after nearly 10 years together, my wife had to go into hospital. Apparently she had some sort of cancer, and in what seemed like less than a week she died. It was a terrible thing. I was in a state which cannot be described, you know. And, I had nobody there in Melbourne, none of my family, you know, nothing. I felt being lost, you know. 18 months after we were married, Irene and I had a baby together, a baby girl we named Karen. It was a very momentous occasion, one that brought my wife and I much closer together. Even as a young child, Karen was always a very clever girl, almost too clever for her own good. I used to always joke. From the very beginning, Karen had an independent streak in her that I think Irene picked up on right away. Karen just seemed so determined to do those things one way, her own. Irene loved Karen immensely and was determined to make something of her daughter. Irene had come from a long line of well-educated family members, and she couldn't stress enough to Karen how the girl should be doing this or that. In many ways, I think it is safe to say I spoiled my little girl. Whenever she wanted anything, she knew who to come to. In later years, I would drive her every day to school, and eventually I even taught her how to drive. In the end, I simply tried to keep everyone happy. I was the mediator. Meanwhile, Rodney, who was so much older than his baby sister, instantly fell in love with her and treated her like a princess.
My brother was 14 years old when I was born, and his first comment on hearing that Mum was pregnant with me was, "Oh, very interesting. How soon before she can do the washing up?" Despite the gap in our ages, he was incredibly attentive to me and spent a lot of time playing with me. As a person, Rodney was very kind-hearted, loyal and compassionate, one who went out of his way to offer his help to others. He was also incredibly bright, completing his Bachelor of Science and Diploma of Education at the University of New South Wales. He excelled in maths and science and taught maths and science at Fort Street Boys and Crow's Nest Boys High Schools. Having been in the Army Reserve at university, he got a taste for the military life and the leadership role he could play as a training officer in the armed forces. He enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force and was almost immediately called up for duty in Vietnam. He was accorded the rank of Wing Commander, and in spite of the obvious risks, he was quite positive about his upcoming trip. One of the last things he had to do before shipping out was to get his smallpox inoculation. I remember seeing him the afternoon before his tragic passing, and he was holding his 3-month-old baby in his arms, playing the proud daddy, begging me to take just one more photo. I said, "But we have taken so many already." His humorous reply was, "You better take one more. You never know if you'll ever see me again." Just hours later, that very night, he died due to an adverse reaction to his inoculation. 26 years old and with a child who was too young to have known him. The odds of it happening are so ridiculously minute, it makes the whole situation even more tragic. It was such a shock to everyone, especially to his young and completely bewildered widow. Dad took it incredibly hard and tried to shut down, but my mother wouldn't allow it, telling me he had to live for the living. We are not meant to bury our children, particularly when Dad had had to struggle so hard to keep Rodney from being adopted out after the death of his first wife. Life can be very cruel sometimes, I guess. I can only say the pain of Rodney's death forged an unusually close relationship between my father and I.
It's a very difficult situation I was in. It's just that everything which I touched came to nothing, and it was desperate. But then that was the one side, and the other side, now I have to keep going. If I want to stay alive, I have to keep going, you know. So I forced myself to stay alive, you know. If my daughter wouldn't have been there, around there, I don't know what I would have done. I have this photo of Rodney framed in my room, and every day I look at it. It is one of my favorite shots of him. Not a day goes past that I don't look at it. It's impossible not to. It's part of me. It's been over 42 years, and even now I find it very hard to think too much about it.
Today, Gunter's motorcycling days are behind him. He'll tell you that himself. That and how after a certain point, the notion of well-being grows more fleeting with each passing day. Aches and pains are all a part of getting older, regardless of what any pharmaceutical company or many doctors will tell you. Gunter will tell you all this and all of it without a trace of self-pity in his voice, but with a mere smile and a simple shrug. What could I do? Dwelling on it and feeling sorry for myself never brought anyone back from the dead, he'd tell me more than once whenever I'd ask him about how he'd ever managed to get through so many of the tragic circumstances he's had to endure. And endure he has, but more importantly, he's done so while steering clear of any spirit-killing cynicism and bitterness. Somehow his sense of humor and his infectious smile remain, shining through as a vivid reminder. A living testament begs the question, if he can do it, are the mountains in my own path really that insurmountable?